Today I'm going to begin a series of discussions talking about evolutionary theory. And before we get into the mechanics of evolution, I would just like to kind of clarify something in terms of the scientific approach to evolution. So I'd like you to indulge me for a moment. I'm going to move back here on the stage, and I'd like you to take a look at where I am on the stage. Take a good look at me. And now I want you to close your eyes until I tell you to open your eyes again. So indulge me. Close your eyes. Okay, open your eyes. Now, you'll see I'm in a completely different position on the stage at this point. And what I'm pretty confident you did not do is when you saw me in the new position was you probably didn't go, oh my gosh, it's magic, or oh my gosh, it's a miracle. I think even intuitively, you probably went to some kind of a mechanism to explain how I got from point A to point B. And again, there would be a number of explanations for that. The most obvious is, oh, I'll bet he walked from point A to point B. But if you didn't witness it, you can't be sure of that. In other words, I might have hopped. Maybe I skipped. Maybe I did a somersault. There are a lot of ways that I could have gotten from point A to point B, and those are all observable phenomena that could explain, or mechanisms rather, that could explain how I got from point A to point B. Furthermore, if it had been a bigger distance, instead of 10 feet, what if it had been 100 feet? Would that have made it a miracle? Or would that have made it magic? No, it's the same mechanisms would explain that. What if it had been 1,000 yards? Would there be different mechanisms behind it? Again, probably not. Because again, if you gave me enough time, one step could lead to another step, lead to another step, would eventually get me that distance as well. So when we look at evolution then, basically scientists are going to take exactly the same approach to all phenomena. When we observe phenomena, we have to practice good science. We have to work in the physical world, the natural world, and we'll look for natural explanations to explain the phenomena that we observe. So for us, evolution is not any kind of a unique phenomenon. It's just another phenomenon, and we look for the mechanisms to explain that phenomenon, just as we would for growth. Small person turns into a big person. Again, there are biological mechanisms that explain that. Mitotic division, differentiation of cells, and so on. Again, all of these theories that we've talked about throughout the semester, chemistry, physics, biological phenomena, we look for the mechanisms behind them so that we can test those and practice good science. So again, for a biologist, then evolution is no different than any of those. And here the phenomenon we're looking at is the diversity of life. How did all of these different species come to be? What's the biological explanation, the biological mechanism that can explain this extraordinary diversity of life that we see on the planet? And again, the answer for that is evolution. So evolution is one of the most highly verified theories that we have in the biological sciences. And so again, there's nothing special about it for us. All right, so let's go ahead and get into evolution and what evolution is. So really, evolution at once is kind of a simple idea, but also a complex idea, as you'll see. But essentially, what evolution is, if we define it, is that it's a genetic change in a population over time. And we can also define that a little more specifically. It's a change in the allelic frequencies in a population over time. So let me explain what I mean by changes in allelic frequencies. Let's look at a population. Obviously, this is a very small population for illustration here. Let's say we have individuals that, for a particular gene, a particular locus, we have individuals that are homozygous recessive. Here we have 3 that are homozygous recessive, 2 that are heterozygous. And so we have a total then of 10 alleles in this population. 2 of them are dominant alleles, so that would mean that 20% of the alleles are dominant alleles, and 80% of the alleles are recessive alleles. And then let's say then that something happens in the population, there's some kind of phenomenon that targets the heterozygotes. In other words, they're at some genetic disadvantage, and they die off in our population, or selected against is the way that we would describe it in an evolutionary sense. So in other words, they're at some genetic disadvantage. They disappear from the population. Now there are only recessive alleles in the population, and as this population expands, that's what will be reflected. Everyone's going to be homozygous recessive, meaning now that the population is 100% recessive alleles. So again, in a short period of time then, we would have a change in the allelic frequencies in this population, and that's really all evolution is. And again, as these changes in allelic frequencies or these genetic changes in a population build up, then that changes the makeup of a population. It can change the physical traits in a population. And so again, it's really a very simple idea, genetic change in a population over time. Also, when we look at biological evolution, again, in the public's mind, a lot of times different ideas get confused. So again, I want to separate and distinguish these ideas. So one being the origin of the universe. Again, that's not what we're going to be talking about when we talk about biological evolution. And that would be, specifically that. How did the universe come to be? The planets, distribution of the planets, and so on, in solar systems and so on. Also the origin of life. How did the first living thing come to be? And again, there's some good science behind both of these, but that's not where we're going to be spending our time. Where we're going to be talking and spending our time is talking about origin of species. And again, for each of these ideas, for each of these phenomena that we observe in nature, there are completely different mechanisms at work. So again, I don't want to try to confuse these ideas. We're specifically going to be looking at how species came to be once life existed. And that's going to be our definition of biological evolution. Now, the father of evolution, I'm sure everyone is aware, is Charles Darwin. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the historical background behind what led to Darwin's initial explanation of evolutionary theory. And again, understand that that was not a complete idea at that time, but it was a well-articulated idea. So anyway, Darwin is considered the father of evolutionary biology, but again, I want you to understand that it wasn't in a vacuum. So his ideas were built on ideas of others. And I'll come back to Darwin in just a second. So really, ideas about evolution are almost as old as written thought. So even going back to Aristotle had a general concept of what evolution was. He thought that perhaps nature could alter traits. He had some ideas that perhaps there was a physical material, a genetic material that was passed from generation to generation that could be altered. Linnaeus is considered the father of classification. And he's also the person who Latinized the biological sciences. So you can blame him for that when we get into classification. Anyway, but in his classifying, basically he grouped organisms according to similarities, kind of separated them according to differences. And really in so doing, he wasn't approaching this from an evolutionary perspective at all, but it couldn't help get people thinking about relationships of organisms. In other words, if you look at a mouse, a rat just kind of looks like a big mouse. If you look at a muskrat, it looks like a giant rat with maybe kind of a stubby snout. A beaver looks like a muskrat with a flattened tail. If you make a stubby tail and add quills to the fur, then a porcupine looks a lot like a beaver. So the point is that people began to say, gee, these things look like they're related to one another. I wonder how they could be related to one another. And so again, it began essentially a discussion of relationships. Charles Buffon was a Frenchman, a respected naturalist, who was really looking at physical processes, and at least in this discussion where he's relevant, is that he really extended the age of the Earth beyond what was considered a biblical age of about 6,000 years. So he was looking at physical processes. He felt that the molten volcanic rocks couldn't have formed in such a short time, and so he began to talk about the age of the Earth being much more than 6,000 years. James Hutton kind of piggybacked on this work. He also was a geologist, considered the father of geology, who extended that timeline even well beyond Buffon, because as people began to think about biological origins of life, they realized that this would take a long time. And so again, an age of an Earth well beyond 6,000 years. And Hutton also is a person who looked at geology over a long period of time and felt that basically the forces of geology that we see shaping the Earth today are the ones that we've seen forever. And that he considered this uniformitarianism. In other words, the forces that we see at Earth at work today are the same ones that worked in the past. And most of these forces are kind of slow and gradual in their function. And so he considered this gradualism, although that term actually came around a little bit later. William Smith looked at the fossil record. And in looking at the fossil record, when we look at different strata, when we look at different levels of sediment in the fossil record, generally the oldest sediments are deeper and more recent sediments would be more towards the surface. And so these would be more ancient organisms when we find fossils and more recent organisms when we get to the top. And so as he looked at the fossil record, he saw relationships between organisms in the fossil record and essentially established that general concept that, gee, these things look a lot alike with some variations. It's almost as if they're related. Lamarck was really the first to address evolution from a truly mechanistic or systematic point of view, in that he not only was observing that there was a relatedness of organisms, he tried to propose a mechanism for this. And so he generally came to the conclusion and defined what natural selection is. But where he really fell short was that he felt that physical properties of organisms could be passed to the next generation. So in other words, if I got in an accident and lost a hand, he felt that that was a property I could pass to the next generation. And although he didn't really coin this term, it became associated with him. He felt that these so-called acquired characteristics, characteristics that you acquire in your lifetime, that those could be passed to the next generation, that they were heritable. And of course, we know that that's not the case. Genes, genetic material is passed from generation, but physical characteristics are not necessarily passed from generation to generation. So Lamarck ended up being kind of ridiculed, and Lamarckism is generally considered an insulting, insulting if someone calls your science Lamarckian. But he actually was a pretty good biologist in his time. He just happened to miss the mark on this particular idea. Georges Cuvier was another Frenchman, a very influential scientist in his time. And he certainly was no evolutionist, but he did have some influence in terms of evolutionary thinking in that as he looked at the fossil record, he recognized that there were a lot of organisms in the fossil record that no longer live today. And so he had this concept that perhaps there had been a number of biblical floods, and then that life had been created after each of these, and that there was a series of catastrophes then in the past as opposed to a slow, gradual progression of the earth. And so he and his followers then became known as catastrophists. And again, in some respects, they were both right. There are slow, gradual aspects to geology, but there are also catastrophic events that occur as well. Lyell was a contemporary, actually a friend of Darwin's. He also was a geologist who studied forces on Earth. He also extended the age of the Earth beyond what Hutton and Buffon had originally proposed. And he also was a gradualist in terms of looking at how the Earth developed. And he actually had a significant impact on Darwin's view of evolution, meaning that evolution also, he thought, was kind of a slow, gradual process. We now know in a modern perspective that that's not always the case, but again, Lyell was a contemporary and influential on Darwin. He also, again, was a gradualist uniformitarian. And then Robert Malthus, interestingly, was an economist who Darwin had read. And Malthus' influence was that he looked at the Industrial Revolution in England and England's status in that Industrial Revolution. And he understood that it was very important to have workers for your factories. And so he felt that it was really important that England have a really good agricultural system, because if he had good agriculture, that would mean more food for the population, that would mean more people. So he tied resources then to an increase in population, and he was looking at this from an economic perspective. Again, Darwin read his materials and eventually applied this to survival of the fittest, if you will, in evolutionary thinking. And then last but not least here, Alfred Wallace came up independently from Darwin with a theory of evolution due to natural selection, largely the same theory that Darwin came up with. And he's the one that eventually led and essentially forced Darwin to go public with his ideas and publish his ideas. All right, so getting back to Darwin then, and how Darwin came up with his concept and his view of evolutionary theory. He initially had trained in some different areas, actually theology, also in medicine. He wasn't really very happy in those studies. And so he was a very good naturalist, had a keen eye for nature, and eventually signed on to travel on a cartography expedition with on a ship called the Beagle. And a lot of times he's described as the naturalist, but he actually went along as a captain's companion. So the captain had to maintain a different social status, had a different social status from the crew. He didn't really mix with the crew. So typically on these long voyages, this one was supposed to be about 2 years, they would bring along someone of their own social status so they could have dinner with them and socialize with them. So that's really what Darwin's role was. So anyway, this 2-year journey ended up being a 5-year journey. It was initially to South America, but eventually circumnavigated the world. And along the way, Darwin basically was free to do whatever he wanted. And so he, again, was an enthusiastic naturalist. He made lots of collections, observations, was reading Lyell's work and others. And he began to formulate his ideas about evolution. because he began to look at the relatedness of organisms. He discovered fossils, for example, saw kind of the relatedness of fossils, and then also a lot of his work, of course, was generated, and his ideas were generated in the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America. So again, as he was traveling, he began to put together his ideas of relatedness of organisms, the concept of family trees, and so on. And certainly he's well known for his work with finches, but really it more or less started with tortoises. As tortoises, one of the things that would happen in the Galapagos is that sailors would stop at the Galapagos and collect tortoises, put them in the hold. Tortoises would live quite a while there, and then they would have meat to eat while they were at sea. And while these tortoises were being loaded, sailors were commenting about which island the tortoises were coming from. And Darwin asked, well, how do you know? And they said, each island has its own tortoise. And as he began to look at the tortoises and their habitats, he noticed how they were modified for their specific habitats. He then began to look at other animals, such as the finches, and he noticed that each island had certain types of finches that were modified to the habitat. And then this began to get him thinking about how nature must be selecting for these characteristics. So when he returned to England, he again began to develop a manuscript. So by the early 1840s, he had a rough manuscript developed, his ideas developed. He circulated this among friends so people knew of his ideas. And basically sat on his ideas for a long time. But eventually Wallace, who went on a similar expedition to Madagascar, I believe, came up with the same ideas. Changes in evolutionary changes due primarily to natural selection. And so this forced Darwin's hand that he actually had to go public and eventually publish his ideas. So his famous book is, as you can see here, has a very long title, but we normally refer to it as Origin of Species or On the Origin of Species. And so even though he and Wallace co-presented their ideas, Darwin usually gets credit for coming up with this idea because he came up with it first, and although he didn't publish it first. All right, so the ideas then that Darwin proposed are really pretty straightforward when you look at origin of species. And one is certainly that variation occurs within species. So he just documents laboriously case after case after case where when you look at species that seemingly look very much alike to us, in other words, as you look at all of these birds here, to you and I, they don't look very dissimilar. But if you look closely, you will see slight differences in coloration. You'll see differences in size and so on. So that there is a variation within any species, not just our own species. Secondly, that there will always be more young produced than will survive to adulthood. And this then creates a struggle for resources. Excuse me. And so this is where Malthus' influence came in. So there was a struggle for food resources, shelter, all kinds of things. But the fact that there were more that were going to survive creates a struggle for existence. Thirdly, that traits are inherited from parents. And so even though at this time no one knew what the genetic material was or even how it was passed from generation to generation, he knew nothing of DNA, RNA, mitosis, meiosis, any of that, but he did feel that there was some substance that was passed from generation to generation, although he didn't know what it was. So that part of his theory was very hypothetical because he didn't have any experience there. And then last but not least, and this is where really it becomes the heart of Darwinian view of evolution, is that selection for certain traits is possible. And again, he really documents very thoroughly how in artificial selection we do that all the time. This is how all of our crops, this is how all of our domesticated animals came to be, is by selecting for specific traits. And then he also makes the assertion and documents clearly that nature can make the same kind of selections as well. So again, in this idea of selection of traits, then he documents case after case after case of artificial selection, and then again documents how nature in so many cases also is selecting for specific traits as well. Now, he called his theory descent with modification. And so in descent with modification, again, he felt that there was some material, substance that was passed from generation to generation. He felt that changes could occur, that this material could be modified, although again, he knew nothing of mutation or DNA or anything. And he also then documented cases where nature was favoring specific traits. And when specific traits were favored then, what the downstream effect of that is differential reproductive success. Because there is a struggle for existence, then some will be more successful than others. And he termed this differential reproductive success then, nature selecting for specific individuals, natural selection. So the idea behind this is, let's say that we're looking at a population, and let's say there's two variants in the population. There's type A and type B. And let's say that type A then, on average, if you have that mix of characteristics, that you could produce 3 offspring per generation. So individual A in this case then would have 3 offspring, and each of those offspring could have 3 offspring. So at the end of 2 generations, you'd have 9 individuals that have that characteristic. And then they would have 3 each, so you'd have 27 in the next generation and so on. And let's say then that there was another variant in the population, type B, that doesn't have as much success, that combination of genetic traits is not as successful, and they on average produce 2 offspring per generation. So type B here would produce 2 offspring, those 2 offspring would produce 2 offspring, so we would have 4 offspring at the end of that generation, and so on. So if we look then at our initial population then, Bs would produce 2 per generation, and As would produce 3 per generation. So if we start at the first generation here, half of the individuals would be of type A. At the end of the second generation, 60% would be type A. Into the third generation, 69% would be type A, and so on. So, I didn't mean to go forward there yet. But so the point is then that if A continues to have this genetic advantage, and nature is selecting for them, saying you have a benefit, I'm selecting you, you get to survive and reproduce to a greater extent than type B does, then those traits will accumulate in a population over time and change that population over time. So again, this is what Darwin knew. This is what he could observe, and this is what he could document with natural selection. And so that becomes the focus of Origin of Species. Now, a couple of other terms that we see and I will be discussing. One is the idea of fitness versus adaptation, or fitness and adaptation. In evolutionary terms, or Darwinian terms, fitness purely means the more fit you are, the more offspring you produce, more viable offspring you produce. So again, it has nothing to do with how fast you can run or anything else. It has purely to do with how many offspring do you produce. So the greater the fitness, the more offspring you produce. Adaptation is a reference to evolution, evolution that makes individuals more fit. So sometimes we feel that evolution is somewhat non-selective, but if it is selective, making individuals more fit, more specialized for a particular habitat, we refer to that as adaptation. Also, a couple of other terms I'll be using, homology versus analogy. When we talk about structures and so on that are homologous, what we're saying, or what I will be saying is, or what that means, is that these would be physical features, chemical features, traits, behaviors, and so on, that have a common evolutionary origin. For example, if we look at the forelimbs of a variety of different mammals, including humans here, arm of a human, leg of a cat, whale fin, and bat wing, they're homologous in the sense that they all have a common evolutionary origin, being some ancient mammalian ancestor, and we could even go back to reptilian ancestors that basically have the same kind of bones. And again, here what we're looking at has been essentially the same bones that have been modified in various ways. So we have the upper arm bone, the humerus, radius ulna, carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And again, in all of these different animals, we'll see really the same bones, but they are just modified in various ways by nature. So again, another aspect of this would be mutation, but we'll get to that later. So as long as they have a common evolutionary origin, then we consider these to be homologous structures. And again, this could also relate to development. So for example, if we compare a chick embryo to a human embryo, we're going to see common steps in embryonic development. We're going to see common features in the embryos. So we would refer to this then as developmental homology. There's behavioral homology. Again, this is a topic I'll come back to, but again, the concept homology, a common evolutionary origin. Now, the other term, analogy, if we say structures are analogous, to give an example of that would be if we compared the wing of a bat then to the wing of an insect. So in the case of a wing of the bat then, again, we're looking at bone here of the wing. And again, this would be homologous to other mammalian forelimbs. And so when we compare that to the wing of an insect, the wing of an insect has a completely different origin. The wing of an insect actually is an outcrop, in effect, of the exoskeleton of an insect. And so there is no common ancestor or common structure in an ancestor that gave rise to both the wing of an insect and the wing of a bat. So we would consider these analogous structures, certainly not homologous structures. Now, another thing I want to say also is that it's very important to understand that Darwinism is in no way modern evolutionary theory. This was a starting point. Darwin published in 1859, and he was very limited in what he knew. But he is a genius because he really was able to put together these concepts, articulate them very well and very thoroughly. But I think, again, it's very important to understand that when people talk about Darwinism and equate that to modern evolutionary theory, that would be like comparing smoke signals to modern communications. It's just not the same thing, because we know so much more about these processes now than Darwin knew. So when people use the term Darwinism interchangeably with modern evolutionary theory, it's really because either they are ignorant of the concepts, or really they're using this as an emotional word to try to manipulate you. So I can't emphasize that enough. These are not the same thing. Darwinism is an element of modern evolutionary theory, but they're not the same thing. So, as we look ahead then to forces that drive evolution, foreshadowing what we'll be talking about in the coming modules, one is inheritance. Traits are inherited. They're passed from generation to generation. As those traits are passed from generation to generation, random genetic changes occur, and we've already talked about both inheritance and random genetic change. Nature decides the value of those changes. We'll also talk about something called genetic drift, which is also a random process, and also migration. As populations move from one place to another, they can bring in genes and alter the nature of a population. And there are some other forces as well, but these are going to be the major forces that we look at. So again, what we're going to be looking at then is that this phenomenon then of genetic change over time has forces behind it. There are driving forces which lead to these genetic changes over time. And we're going to be looking at these step by step. And hopefully you'll have a very good understanding of evolution when you finish.